Is it? Okay, hello everybody. Today I have the pleasure to have a conversation with Thomas777. Okay, Thomas is a revisionist author and a content creator, and he specializes about the World War, the Cold War, the Spanish Civil War, and US politics in general. Thomas wrote two books, and he also wrote many articles, and he's a regular guest on the Pete Quinones podcast. Also, Thomas owns a bachelor degree in political science. So, Thomas, I thank you very much for accepting my invitation today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for hosting me, man.
Yeah, okay. So before we go to the main theme, because we talk about World War II revisionism today, uh, before I would like to know, I have heard through other people that you consider yourself as a national socialist. Please tell us about that.
I mean, I think that there's a misunderstanding among a lot of people. You know, there's perennial ideas and imperatives that, and the way those things manifest, both in terms of direct action as well as in, you know, in terms of how people mobilize around those principles, those perennial principles. That's kind of historically contingent, but you know, like the core ideas remain, you know, and such that there's any. I tend to look at Adolf Hitler almost like, I mean, I agree with R.H.S. Stolfe. He died a few years ago. He was this naval war college type, and he wrote a lot on military science. But shortly before he died, he wrote this really great biography of Hitler that I think is second only to John Toland's, really. And you know, the way he talked about Hitler, he said Hitler was a messianic personage, you know, not in theological terms, but in historical terms. You know, and I agree with that assessment. You know, I look at Hitler as like a Cromwell figure. Yep, that's the Toland book. Yeah, that's a great book. I look at Hitler as if I having a counterpart in Cromwell or Muhammad. I mean Napoleon as well, but I think Cromwell and Muhammad are a better analogy. But you know, the when you're talking about a messianic personage, you know, you're talking about a man who's not just astride the zeitgeist and sort of discrete and unique capacities, but also you're talking about you know, an individual who transcends history, while at the same time sort of embodying the historical moment in which he is alive and active. So I mean, that's what I understand National Socialism and fascism, which are distinctive ideological tendencies but related. And you know, people who accept that and abide that doesn't mean they want to go out. It doesn't mean I want to go out and pretend it's the 1930s or like dress up like Horst Wessel or try and bring back like 20th century ideological paradigms or something. But it suggests a recognition of the perennial significance of, you know, the ideas and imperatives that people like Hitler or like Oswald Mosley or like Quadriano or like Mussolini were this, or you know, or like you know, a number of other figures who kind of advanced those ideas and ideals. What, you know, what they kind of what they were the standard bearers of. There's something transcendent and perennial about that. So I think that that's important, and that's also the reason why. It's also the reason why the ruling regime kind of tries to paint everybody as a fascist that they don't like, because they realize there's like an intrinsic power there, and
Yes.
you know, they're not sophisticated in the way they critique these things or the way they try and slander people. But obviously, if we're just talking about something that was like just this kind of like discrete historical anomaly that has no significance outside of its epoch, like obviously they wouldn't do that. Okay. So that's basically what I mean, and like I don't insinuate my own values into my writing unless it's appropriate. But yeah, I mean, I certainly don't mind people asking. But yeah, that's the best way I can explain it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now my main question is well, why the Second World War was not a good war like we are told by the court historian, government school, and Hollywood movies. So I would like that you tell us what's your answer for this question, please.
Well, I mean, there's certain epistemic priors that you must internalize if you accept that paradigm. Like basically, the ethical basis of world order and kind of political life since 1945. The suggestion is that World War II was this criminal conspiracy hatched by men in Berlin and Tokyo and Rome. You know, it existed outside of normal political imperatives. You know, the Axis powers were singularly evil, and you know, pretty much every conflict, prior or subsequent, existed in a kind of moral gray area. But World War II was an example of stark good and evil, and you know, the people who were on the losing side were the exemplars of a kind of absolute evil.
Yeah.
So I mean, the only way you could accept that, because that's ridiculous for all kinds of reasons. It's just not the way warfare develops, and that's not the way that politics plays out anywhere in any epoch. But you know, the whole that's an ideological narrative that's basically tailored to prop up the current regime, and the current regime is it's from the top down. It's committed to, you know, rooting out and eliminating any kind of competing ideologies or values, paradigms, or you know, or anything remotely oppositional. And the reason it does that is because it aims at a revolutionary social engineering imperative. Okay, and so that's basically where people need to start. You know, they need to ask, like, well, why is this conflict singular and exceptional? You know, why is it that it's, you know, utterly imperative according to the regime that you accept this sort of moral paradigm, and you know, what are the implications therein? You know, and the world today is structured around that narrative. That's like the founding narrative, and that's the seminal event from which, you know, world order is currently structured. You know, that, and people need to understand that too. Like, people need to understand that since this 1945, and even more so since 1989, there's only one form of government. Okay, there's globalism, and then there's these outlier states that are kind of the resistance to globalism. You know, probably the most powerful actor in that regard is Russia. Like that's not just like Russia has some great government or something, or that you should like it. I mean, maybe people do, maybe they don't. But the point is, Russia's outside of that paradigm. You know, so is Iran. Sort of various constellations of Islamic groups. You know, it's complicated. That's about outside the scope of what we're talking about. But like a lot of people, particularly on the right, they've got this idea that somehow there's still this sort of like Westphalian order where like individual countries have sovereign power. That's not the way things are anymore, and things haven't been that way in 100 years. Okay, you know, the Cold War was the 45-year struggle to determine like how globalism would be configured.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and because the American NATO Zionist model prevailed over the Stalinist model. I mean, so you have globalism, you know, but that's the government you live under. You don't live under like the legacy government of George Washington or something.
No,
if you live in France, you don't live under like, you know, the legacy government of like the Franks from like 800 AD or something. Like you live under this global regime that really came about in 1945.
go on.
Well, I mean that's the best way I can describe it in terms of like why it's important. I mean, it's like that's why it's not just an academic. That it's not just like some academic point of interest to, you know, like historians or whatever. I mean, that's why.
Okay. My main position as a libertarian is that World War II was not a good war, and that it would have been a lot better to not intervene against Germany, and that Germany was not a threat to Western civilization. I think it's clear that Germany didn't want war with the West. I think they had imperialist ambition in Eastern Europe, but that for me that didn't justify that the West declare war on Germany. So,
Oh yeah, I mean it goes without saying, and you can't. I mean, if people are going to pull the morality card, like, oh, you know, the German Reich did bad things, it's like, okay, well, I mean, the Soviet Union exterminated 10 million people before a shot was fired in World War II. Like, you can't, you can't pull that card and have any credibility. And I mean, it's nobody has to, and it's also, I mean, nobody has to like Adolf Hitler, and nobody has to like, you know, the way that politics were configured in from 1933 onward, with this idea that the quote West can be a threat to itself, so you must ally with the Soviet Union to destroy Europe. I mean, you don't. I mean, Hitler may have been the most evil man who ever lived. You still don't annihilate your own civilization like that. You just don't do that. That's suicidally insane, and it's basically unprecedented. I mean, the Spartans allied with the Persians against the Greeks, which is interesting because people hold up. I think it's because they read too many comic books or something. They hold up Sparta as like this like incredible base like utopia. Sparta was a dirty word for centuries because they betrayed their own race. You know, you do not ally with Persia against a Greek city-state. You just don't do that. It doesn't matter what the stakes are. There's certain lines you don't cross. And I think of when I think of the UK and America deciding to ally with the communists to annihilate Europe, it's a similar paradigm. It's just something you don't do. It's like murdering your brother and like raping his wife and saying, well, my brother was a bad man. You know, he drank too much, so I had to do it. You know, you just don't do that.
No. So, what would you say that are the fundamental cause for World War II? Why did that war happen?
I mean, at base, people are gonna think this is strange, but I mean, or maybe they won't. I mean, people familiar with my work product, you know that I tend to cite Eric Hobsbawm a lot. You know, and he was very much like a Marxist Leninist, but he was a serious historian, and you know his.
Can you repeat the name, please?
Yeah, Eric Hobsbawm.
Yes.
Yeah, but he, you know, with obvious qualifications. I mean, I basically agree with his analysis. I mean, the story of the 20th century is basically it's the ascendancy. It's the way to understand is the ascendancy of revolutionary communism, and the response to that. Okay, you know, and Hobsbawm talked about the quote short century, of 1918 to 1989. You know, yes. Contra the long century of the period from, you know, Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo until 1914. So I mean, the emergence of Marxist Leninism as this animating principle, and the kind of revolt of what was then called, not so delicately, the colored world, you know, against the developed West, you know, and the kind of egalitarian leveling that technology facilitated, you know, in terms of, you know, most significantly in terms of military power and other stuff. You know, this was world shaking, quite literally.
Yes.
melodramatic as that might sound. So basically, the 20th century was like that's the way to understand it. Okay, and that I mean, there was ontological factors too. That's one of the reasons why I I cite Heidegger so often in my own work product. There was a basic crisis in Western civilization, this kind of confrontation with modernity, and that's like every European thinker you know from like Hobbes to Fichte to Kant to Hegel to Schopenhauer to Nietzsche to Heidegger, like they took for granted this confrontation with modernity and what the implications were and what like Western man's fortunes would be therein and how he would come to terms with this, in terms of his own capacity for faith, in terms of how he organized his affairs at scale. This is very profound stuff, okay? So there was that too, but that itself is bound up with, the emergence of revolutionary communism, which is kind of like a reductionist tendency. I mean, not kind of, it was, and it was an effort to sort of radically distill down human affairs into a paradigm that was cognizable and like manageable. But so there's a lot there, okay, and like we're getting into like the territory of theology and religious matters, which I'm not afraid to talk about, but that's a little bit outside the scope. But
Okay.
in terms of the brass tacks, material causes, and like nakedly political causes, it was revolutionary communism and the emergence of the truly global state. Okay, like what concomitant, like the Soviet Union was the first superpower. Okay, but it was the first country that began organizing in those terms, and then America rapidly did too. But this kind of power potential changed everything also. And Europe. It's important to understand the Third Reich as a European tendency. Hannah Arendt, who was a student of Heidegger, she made that point again and again. This wasn't German nationalism. Like nationalism was dead by 1918. Like nobody thought that way anymore, and it would be self-defeating to have thought that way. So it was the emergence of the superpower. Europe would become a superpower or would perish. So I mean, it was all of those things.
I never read Eric Hobsbawm, but I've read, and in fact, a month ago, I interviewed a Marxist historian named Jacques Pauwels. Here, unfortunately, the book is in French, but his books have been translated in English. Do you know Jacques Pauwels?
Yeah, I know of him, and I've seen him cited by a lot of people I respect. I've never like deep dived into his like the original sources and his own books, but yeah, I know who he is.
Yeah. So even if look, he's a Marxist, he doesn't hide it, and well, I was before I became a libertarian. I'd say around 2010. I was a Marxist. I was a Trotskyite, which is funny because Jacques is more of a Stalinian. But
yeah,
we had great conversation. I read every of his books. But for me, the fundamental cause of a world war, I would say it's the fact that the state intervenes in the economy. But I wouldn't say it's just that. That's why I asked the question to a lot of people in order to bring the most possible arguments, because I really think that in any way, if I can help convince people to reconsider World War II, I think it's for the best, because the myth of World War II for me really is like the cancer that it's like a cancer that maintains our society in the current state. So,
well, I mean, there's an anti-intellectualism, like a mile wide. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with reading guys on the left and the Stalinist left. I mean, even these days, guys like Jackson Hinkle, I don't know if some of your listeners know of him. He's basically such that I read his stuff, that he drops like on social media and YouTube. I think he basically abides kind of Emmanuel Wallerstein's like neo-Marxist view of, what I think what Wallerstein calls, world systems theory, but Hinkle is basically a Stalinist. And a lot of those guys, I mean, obviously there's fundamental differences between us, but a lot of those guys are serious guys, and I think a lot of them have a good grasp of Hegelian thought, which to me is fundamentally important. And they're like the serious left is kind of making a comeback. But one of the things that's insidious about like the good war narrative is what you just said. I mean, it basically cuts off all conversation and judgments of, and critical judgments, like it's not a good thing, man. I mean, beyond the obvious, it's not a good thing at all.
The spark that made me become a revisionist go back quite far in my life when I was a child. For me, but I repeat it because every time I talk to someone, I repeat this thing. It was when I was shown the movie Gandhi in I think in 1985. I'm a year older than you. I'm born in 1975. And I remember watching the movie Gandhi and when I was 10 years old, and there was a scene where the British soldiers were firing at a crowd of men, women, and children of Indian that were unarmed because they were protesting. And that was traumatizing. That was really violent scene. And a few years later, I got my first history class, and I remember my mother had told me about the Holocaust, and when I got my first history class, I was told, of course, World War II, the good allies versus the evil German and Japanese. And then I remember, hey, the British soldiers, the British are supposed to be the good one, but I saw a movie where they fire hot. They would fire at a crowd of unarmed women and children. So for me it was the spark. But later I came to learn that apparently the war was started in Europe because Germany had invaded Poland. So Britain and France declared war on Germany. But then I also realized, hey, but Britain and France, they had invaded and occupied maybe a quarter of the land mass of the planet in the form of colonialism. And I know that colonialism, there was a part of it that, they brought some element of civilization, that we can say that they helped in some way the people. But there was also pretty violent and exploitive stuff. So I think we have to be nuanced. But the evil of colonialism, I think, is real. So I say, hey, isn't it a kind of hypocrite that you're the two biggest empires, and you declare war on Germany because Germany invaded Poland, and we know that Poland had German land under its. They were part of Poland that were German because they were given after the Versailles Treaty, like the city of Danzig. And I know Hitler was asking to Poland to give back. The city of Danzig, but because Poland got a war guarantee from the British Empire, I think it's the reason why they refused. So what do you think of all that? Does it?
Well, yeah, and it's also, I mean, the Polish government, it was this crazy military junta. It really was crazy. It was making irrational decisions. They were ethnically cleansing Germans, Russians, Jews, Ukrainian, anybody they didn't like. It was this bizarre, out of control regime, and this idea that it was some beacon of democracy, whatever that means. I mean, even within the kind of bounded rationale of British propaganda, I mean, that's preposterous. Well, and of course, too, I mean, the Soviet Union assaulted Poland at the same time, weeks subsequent. And I mean, apparently that was okay, but and why is Poland sacrosanct? No one can explain that. And I mean, people who dig into the record, the Germans basically, all Berlin wanted was Berlin's like, we'll build up Polish infrastructure to basically bring the Autobahn through Poland. We'll basically subsidize development into a modern state, all we'd ask is, for strategic cooperation contra the Soviet threat. And the Germans wanted dedicated access routes to Danzig. They said Danzig can even stay under Polish, authority as long as we have dedicated access routes to it. And, the cultural life of the people there. And Danzig was literally 99.9% German speaking, won't be interfered with. And like the Polish junta, it was almost kind of like, although not as bizarre and irrational, but close. It was almost kind of like the Ukrainian regime of today. Like it was this like hyper violent, irrational, self-destructive regime. So this idea that this idea, to your point too, this idea that UK cares about like whether Polish people can go vote or not, like that's ridiculous. Like they were lording over something like 700 million people who had no voting rights or anything. Like it's like that's ridiculous. And but again, even if I encourage other people who have revisionist sympathies, it's like, look, don't let your opponents establish the kind of parameters of discourse. It's like, again, even if for the sake of argument, Germany was this kind of caricaturishly evil country, you still don't destroy your own civilization, according to some alleged moral imperative or something. Yeah. But I mean, particularly when, again, it's like court history loses on the morality issue. I mean, if I don't even think that's appropriate to insinuate into discussions of political history, but I mean, even if it was, it's like, well, I mean, the Soviet Union literally annihilated 10 million human beings, before September 1939. So, I mean, that somehow isn't important. All that matters is the moral is the moral report card, as it were, of Germany. So there's that too.
But we know that, and at the end of the war, Poland was not free, because Poland was forced under communism for like 45
years.
So it's like Britain and France are the two biggest empire that violated the sovereignty of hundreds of millions of people under colonialism. But they declared war on Germany because Germany wanted to get back German land from Poland. And at the end of the war, finally, but Poland, and not only Poland, half of Europe, mostly Eastern Europe, are given to communist dictatorship. But as a libertarian, I call that unintended consequence and very, very bad cost versus benefit thing. So,
well, no, the whole narrative falls apart under the most rudimentary scrutiny. And another scholar who I cite a lot, particularly in I cite him particularly liberally in this manuscript I'm working on right now, is Robert Conquest. And his most famous book was probably The Great Terror, where but I think his most significant work was called Kolyma, the Arctic Death Camps. Mm-hmm. And it's not hyperbole. I mean, the Soviet Union from 1922 really until around the time of Khrushchev's ascendancy, really until 1958, 59. I mean, so for a generation, I mean, there was this massive system of death camps, and millions of people died in them. People who were viewed as categorically undesirable or, quote, politically unreliable. People who hadn't done anything at all, but who were denounced by neighbors, or who ran afoul of some policeman or something. I mean, this was an entire swaths of Russian society were exterminated. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you can't get away from that, and you can't somehow like I found too that there's this kind of dummy rebuttal of court history, like, oh, but that was just tyranny, it wasn't racism, like as if there's some sort of difference between in ethical terms.
Exactly. Yeah,
But it's also there was like an ethno-sectarian component to it. I mean, that's a discussion another time, but it's like they can't they can't like argue their way out of it rationally, so they fall back on these shibboleths like quote unquote racism, whatever that means, is somehow this intractable evil, and all other categories of violence are pale in comparison to the severity or the moral impropriety of this. It doesn't make any sense. But Conquest, after the Berlin Wall, after the inter-German border ceased to exist, and people like Conquest got access to the Soviet archives, which for a brief period of about 1993, probably until about 97, 98, when the FSB, which was a successor to the KGB, they kind of tightened the reins again and closed off information access. But there was about 4 or 5 years where it was pretty open and accessible. If anything, Conquest, it became clear he underestimated the degree of homicidal magnitude of the Soviet system. Probably all told, probably 40, 50 million people died, in the Soviet Union alone. I mean, this is a monstrous, the scale of this is monstrous and almost inconceivable, and again, I'm not suggesting that it's correct to kind of keep some tally of attrition and deciding, identifying bad actors in history or something. But, if you're talking about the sheer scale of destruction of human life, like the human cost of communism utterly dwarfs like all other ideologies, actors, and imperatives. It's not even arguable.
But that we were talking about Marxist historian like Hobsbawm and Jacques Pauwels, but you probably know that these people disagree with Conquest and think that he very exaggerate and that his sources are totally bogus. I'm not saying they are right. I tend to believe that communism was a very murderous system, for the simple reason that they have absolute power and their economic system is so inefficient in many ways. So I tend to believe it. And I believe that every genocide, I think we should have the right to discuss if we agree or disagree. And now I know that I live in Canada, so there is one genocide related to World War II that I'm not allowed to discuss today, unfortunately. But for communism, I tend to think that Conquest was right. Okay, maybe it's possible. You said that you think he underestimated. Sometimes I tend to think maybe he exaggerated it a little bit, but I'm no expert in that. So, but as I said, I tend to think that communism is so irrational and evil, even if its intention can be good. Because I was a Marxist, and I understand how you can become such a person. It can be very attractive in some situation, but the system itself is very violent and irrational. So,
well, I mean, if you're talking about the categorical destruction of human beings according to political criteria, subjective political criteria, I mean, 1789 is where that first emerged. Something that Jacobins would do, they'd put people on these ships. They were called Noyade ships. I can't remember the exact.
Noyade mean drowning in French.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So they'd cast people out on these ships that would then be scuttled, like thousands of people at a time. People who'd been branded politically unreliable, people who refused to abandon Catholicism, people who were viewed as reactionary, or just people, men and women and kids too, who were just viewed as part of some lumpen class of undesirables. They were exterminated. And there's something there's something about Jacobinism and communism that's implicitly homicidal, because if you're gonna, the only way to, it's essentially psychological in nature. And that's kind of the point of the final act of 1984. Like, if you remember, and if the listeners remember,
I
when
never
Winston,
had it, unfortunately, but I should.
no, but well, it's just briefly when Winston Smith, he's finally exposed by the um by the secret police as being this dissident. So he's being tortured by O'Brien, who's his former comrade, who is now his torturer. So he says to O'Brien under torture, like, I'll say whatever you want. I'll stop agitating against the government. And O'Brien's like, no. He's like, we don't want you to merely comply, because then you don't actually believe in it. Like, we've got to eradicate the enemy idea. We've got to make it so that you can't harbor these ideas in your mind anymore. And that's not just science fiction. I mean, that really was the Bolshevik enterprise. And so if you're going to, really the only way to eradicate the reactionary idea is you got to eradicate the vessels that bear it, which are human beings, And of course, the Third Reich responded in kind, by exterminating the exterminator. I mean, they viewed the Jewish world of social existence as the progenitor of communism, like rightly or wrongly. And thus, like, Jews were targeted. It's more complicated than that, but the point being, I mean, this is this is a real phenomenon. Okay, so there's really no way that Marxist-Leninism is implemented without categorically exterminating people who are not, to be euphemistic about it, politically educable. It's not just this like accidental feature of the system, or it's not just, people becoming brutal owing to historical conditions that facilitate it. It truly is like intrinsic to the ideology. I don't think that, and I think that's a fundamentally important point that a lot of people aren't willing to confront.
But the fact that they're against private property, I think private property is natural. You own your body and you own the fruits of your labor. And because we are all unequal, some people will succeed better than others. I worked hard and saved money to buy a small farm. The idea that someone would like to steal my little land and my little farm because of their communist ideology, I would not like that, and would probably defend myself and with other people if possible. But I remember when I was a Marxist, and there was something that I was told by another comrade, is that the end justify the end justify the means when the end is justified, because for them, they're convinced that capitalism is the cause of world wars, poverty, and right now, because I still listen to some Trotskyite, and they are brilliant people among them, I must admit. They say, look, we're facing a possible third world war where everybody could die on the planet, but for them the problem is private property, which
they view human beings as just so many integers, I believe.
Yeah.
Let's even, in a more prosaic example, like this insurance executive who got gunned down by that young guy. Like, I see there's these people who are cheering that on. I don't even think these are people who have been somehow, I mean, insurance companies do a lot of bad things. I'm the last person who's going to sit here and defend them. But a lot of these people who are cheering on the death of this guy, I think it's just as simple as like petty resentment. Like, oh, he's some rich guy, so he deserved to be blown away. And that's a really nasty tendency, but unfortunately it's perennial. And I think in a lot of, once that kind of violence against people who perceive others as like having more than them, or like enjoying some sort of privileged mandate that they don't have, and people particularly, modern life kind of devises endless miseries, like both by accident and by design. You get unsophisticated people who are angry, like they develop a kind of like they develop a kind of like aimless bloodlust, and if something like gives that form, they find it really cathartic, and that's really fucking terrifying.
Yeah.
Potentially, and that's like, think about that take that example I just cited, which admittedly is sort of like an isolated incident, and I'd like to I would hope that a lot of this cheerleading around it is just kind of so much cap and bravado on the internet or whatever. But they take that tendency at scale with real homicidal intent vested in the hearts and minds of the advocates of that perspective, and you potentially have a situation where millions of people die really for no reason at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about the evils of communism as a consequence of World War II. Okay, we think it's clear that the consequence of fighting World War II led that, we are told that the Nazi Germany was an evil tyranny that needed to be get rid of, but as a consequence and for the cost of tens of millions of death and destruction, we replaced Nazi Germany in Europe by the Soviet Union, and most of the land that Imperial Japan occupied during World War II were replaced by other communist regime, especially Mao in China and other places. But I want to come back to, why do you think that, what was the motivation of Britain and France for declaring war on Germany in 1939, and why did they refuse the many peace offers that Hitler made in 1939 and 1940? So these are two questions.
France is different than that of the UK. Like, a lot of people forget, France became one of the Axis powers. Subsequently,
yes.
And France and Germany are geostrategic rivals. There's an axiomatic paradigm there. When the French lost too, like, they capitulated, Hitler made the point. He's like, we're not going to impose a draconian peace on France, other than the coastal areas until 44, until 42, the entirety of the country wasn't occupied, for that reason. But there's a tragic history between Germany and France, and the last defenders of the Reichstag were 33rd SS, which was a French division. Mm-hmm. The defenders, the Axis defenders in North Africa, when the Americans landed at Operation Taurus, were Frenchmen. The French situation was complicated. The UK, the UK was hijacked really by this like Zionist cadre who kind of found their man in Winston Churchill, who was willing to burn down, figuratively, the entire country, the entire empire, to basically pursue a policy of war at all costs. Mm-hmm. That's why. The German disposition towards London was always, why exactly are you attacking us? And they were met with, instead of rational responses, these bizarre kind of soaring declarations that we will never stop fighting Germany. And it didn't make rational sense. That was the whole point. Churchill was there to wage war at all costs on Germany. And that's why it was and the UK lost World War II. Like, it would be like if an American president pursued a policy of war at all costs. Subsequently, America lost all of its territory, save that of the original 13 colonies, mm-hmm. and was hundreds of billions in debt.
Yeah.
And it liquidated basically all of its assets. Yeah. But people insisted, America won the war. Like, it's really bizarre, the cognitive dissonance. But the key takeaway is that the situation of France and the UK was very different vis-a-vis Germany. Like later, like de Gaulle was insinuated as this kind of man on white horse, but in a very contrived way, you know, and obviously too, like as things proceeded in the Cold War, like there was very much a low intensity and sometimes not so low intensity civil war in France, you know, between you know, both the right and the left and the Gaullist regime that had a monopoly on power. But there was a grave discomfort among Frenchmen and women with the way things had developed in a way there wasn't in the UK. But that's kind of a subject for like a dedicated discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we also have many proofs that that Germany really sincerely tried to make peace by even, I would say, renouncing to some advantage. So they gave up. I would even say maybe the possibility of maybe have won the war, I think, in order to make peace with Britain. I think about the Dunkirk battle. I think for me it's clear that Hitler ordered his army to spare something like 300,000 British and French soldiers, and those soldiers were able to get back in Britain and be available to continue to fight. Do you agree with me that Hitler at that point really he renounced to destroy what was left of the British army just in order to make peace? Do you agree?
Well, yeah, I mean, and he was abiding Westphalian Convention. I mean, within the moral consensus. I mean, this is what's insane too about, you know, Churchill ordered the bombing of Berlin over and over and over and over again to provoke a response because the Germans weren't gonna start bombing British civilian centers. Mm-hmm. The Germans didn't even have a real strategic bombing capability, but this concept of you wage total war on your own civilization with no quarter. I mean, that's insane. That's literally insane. You know, and really, it wasn't until it became clear that Churchill was totally compromised. He was going to proceed totally irrationally. I mean, it wasn't really until the war had dragged on for years that Berlin came to accept that, you know, we've got to start treating the United Kingdom as a mortal enemy because they're proceeding in this nakedly irrational manner. But yeah, there's not people who act as if there's some mystery to what developed at Dunkirk. They either don't understand or they're deliberately sort of not addressing, you know, the fact of what had been convention since 1648, and which should go without saying that within a cultural paradigm of moral consensus, you obviously don't treat your military rivals as like existential threats to your being or as mortal enemies. You know, I make a point again and again, and it's a Carl Schmitt point, that there was nuances to the Greek language, you know, and the difference between a hostis and a inimicus is like what translates to hostis and inimicus is significant. You know, the former could be understood as a rival, you know, kind of within a general moral paradigm or within, you know, a common culture of moral understanding. Like the latter is like your existential foe, you know, who would destroy you if he is not vanquished. And they're not the same thing. And treating the former as the latter is something that rational people don't transgress.
Why do you think that Germany invaded Western Europe? For me, I see my answer to that is that since Britain and France had declared war on Germany, since they had refused many peace offers, and since they were continuing to being in an aggressive state against Germany, I would say that Germany didn't have on a military scale, and I'm really not an expert on anything military, but just logically, I think they kind of didn't have the choice. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I mean, that's what it was. And, Europe it was two things. It was what you just said. It was military exigency. But also, I mean, like we discussed at the top of the hour, I mean, Europe had to become a superpower or die. And consolidating Europe into a cohesive whole, whereby these obsolescent or contentious political structures and ambitions and discrete impulses were not yet smoothed out, that had to be resolved too, and unfortunate. I mean, Germany and France would have come to some kind of concord, I believe, anyway, absent, the treason and manipulation of the situation by Roosevelt and the New Dealers. But, the often the proverbial birth pangs of a new political culture, particularly, one that comes to incorporate theretofore discreetly, at least nominally independent actors or agents therein. And it's often a painful process. But yeah, I mean, in immediate terms, it was because, well, I mean, that's why, to your point, I mean, that's why the Sitzkrieg, the phony war, it's Germany, the UK and France like declare war on Germany, and the Germans are like, well, now what? We have no interest in waging war with you. Like, you're just going to assault us, like, for the glory of Poland? I mean, like, it didn't make any sense. And then, unfortunately, about 40,000 people died, all told, in the Western campaign in France, unless my figures are off. But it shouldn't have happened. But the French were convinced that some sort of attrition, that they could win some kind of attrition battle contra Germany with hardened fortifications. It's overly simplified in kind of pop military history, like what the French perspective was. Like, there's an internal logic to what Paris was thinking, but yeah, it's basically what you said. Forgive me for the rambling answer. Like, I'm still a little bit worn out from my illness.
No problem. Okay, I know, but now there's a topic that unfortunately I'm not allowed to discuss, and it's the Holocaust. For me, I hate that word because World War II killed something like between 60 and 80 million human beings. I hate the idea that the death or the so-called death of a certain number of specific individuals that that are of an ethnic and religious group would be more important. I really hate that and find that hypocrite. Me, I was that I think it's clear that a lot of Jews died during World War II, and maybe in a specific fashion that was not very funny. Me, I see what we call the Holocaust, so the fact that Jews died during World War II. Me, I see it as an unintended consequences of the war itself. I think that without the war, or if the war had just been limited to, let's say, Germany and the Soviet Union, because I think for me that Nazi Germany had imperialist ambitions against the Soviet Union. I think Hitler told that he wanted to have a part maybe of Eastern Europe and look, I'm not supporting that, but I don't, as I said, the Allies were really not better on that, and at least I will say that Germany try to have its own empire without provoking the British Empire. But for what is the Holocaust, I think it's an unintended consequences that the war became global. So I blame the Western allies a lot on that, because I think that the original plan for Nazi Germany was probably to deport the Jews outside of its empire or of Germany itself, and that because they were stuck with them in camp while they were losing the war, they finally decided to kill them. Without arguing about the number or the means, because we cannot really do that. What I just said, do you kind of agree with me? Does it make sense, or do you want to add something about that?
Well, no, I mean, that's the issue. It's like, why is anytime if someone's talking about like a quote Holocaust is a burnt offering to a god, like anyone who invokes those kinds of that kind of terminology isn't talking about historical events. They're talking about some sort of theological notion or some kind of fantasy of like martyrdom of a discrete population. You know, and like why are people discussing World War II in these terms as kind of like describing it as like this like the martyrdom of this like discrete group of people? Like, that's ridiculous. But it's also too, I mean, there's most of the narrative as presented, I mean, it's presented as some sort of criminal conspiracy targeting this discrete population, because that's basically the kind of legal illogic of Nuremberg and the way that, you know, the narrative came to be characterized, because there was obviously an eye to establish precedent of at least a formally juristic nature, which, I mean, that's a ridiculous enterprise if we're talking about historical events. But, you know, but it's also the over 100,000, you know, quote, racial Jews as defined by the Nuremberg laws, like, served in the Wehrmacht. You know, like Erhard Milch was like a quote racial Jew. You know, so is Emil Maurice. Like, so we're, I think about 6 or 8 general Feldmarschals. You know, like this idea that, I mean, the way like people were treated if they were quote racially Jewish, it like differed radically depending on where you were, depending on who you were, depending on what your role was. You know, I mean, the short answer is what I said earlier. You know, the Bolshevik enterprise, it's implicitly homicidal at massive scale. Mm-hmm. And if you accept that the war in the East was, you know, a true like Rosenkrieg, and, you know, for context, the Soviet Union declared that it was exempt from the Geneva Convention, and it refused to recognize its legitimacy. So, I mean, there was no any kind of moral consensus that could have said to exist between Europe and Russia, was gone, you know, by 1921-22. But the German notion became, in ontological terms, that the Jewish world of social existence is the progenitor of communism, and communism is an exterminationist existential threat to Europe and European civilization. So the way to combat that is to literally exterminate the would-be exterminator. That's the basic paradigm. It's a complicated question, but
yes, I know, and we're not.
No, it's fine that you asked. I deal with this question all the time, but yeah, it's we're coming up on an hour. If you want to do a second hour, that'd be fine. But I'd ask that we do it tomorrow or sometime next week.
Yes, okay. You would prefer to do it in some different part?
Yeah. Just because I'm kind of, like I said, I'm still kind of fatigued from being sick.
What I suggest, because me, I want I'm almost done asking questions. For the remaining, I wanted that we share book reading, because if people want to learn about that, they can listen to people like us, but I think we need to read book. So whether like you prefer, we could do a second part where we would just discuss revisionist book. Is
Yeah,
that
that's fine, man. However you want to, yeah, however you want to proceed with that, it's fine.
okay? So we're rescheduling another time just to talk about revisionist reading. Is that okay?
Yeah, that'd be great, man.
Okay, so I thank you very much, Thomas, for today, and I will be looking to talk to you again.
No, it's great, buddy. Thank you very much.